I am a 36-year-old woman, and for most of my life I believed I was ordinary. Not in a self-deprecating way, just steady. I had a job that paid the bills, a husband who seemed solid, and a home that was neither extravagant nor modest. My life was a rhythm of routines: morning coffee, work commutes, quiet dinners. I didn't think much about destiny, betrayal, or the kind of cruelty people whisper about in hushed tones. But life has a way of tearing down the walls of our small illusions when we least expect it. For me, that destruction began the morning I went into the hospital for what was supposed to be a simple routine surgery. It was my appendix. The pain had started as a sharp ache in my lower abdomen that would come and go, and after one sleepless night clutching my stomach, Thomas insisted we drive to the ER. The scans confirmed what I suspected: inflamed appendix. Surgery was recommended. It wasn't a big deal, they told me. I'd be in and out in a day. I remember sighing in relief, thinking, at least it's not something serious. Thomas was by my side, his hand warm on mine as I signed the consent forms. He smiled, kissed my forehead, and said he'd be there when I woke up. I trusted him, as I always had. The anesthesiologist's voice faded as the mask descended, and the last thing I thought was that this would just be a story I'd laugh about later. But when I woke, the world tilted. The bright recovery lights burned my eyes, and I was drowning in a pain that was deeper, stranger than anything I'd expected. It wasn't just my abdomen that hurt. There was a throbbing emptiness, a raw ache in a place that made no sense. My body felt altered, hollowed. The nurse, a young woman with trembling hands, adjusted my IV and kept avoiding my eyes. I knew something was wrong. My heart monitor beeped faster, betraying my panic. She hesitated, glanced at the door, and finally drew the curtain around my bed. Her voice was barely a whisper, but her words detonated inside me. "Didn't they tell you about the second procedure?" The blood drained from my face. I could barely form words. "What second procedure?" My throat was dry, cracked. Her eyes flickered with fear. "Your husband? He signed the approval. The doctor said it was necessary, but I just... Why would he approve that procedure?" I felt the floor vanish beneath me. "What procedure?" I asked again, louder, desperate, my voice cutting through the curtain's flimsy fabric. She swallowed hard. "A hysterectomy." The world went silent. The hum of machines, the footsteps outside, even my own breathing, it all seemed to recede into a vacuum. My body turned cold. My womb. My ability to bear children. The part of me I had dreamed in quiet moments of one day using, even though Thomas and I hadn't yet started a family. Gone. Erased while I slept. I shook my head violently. No. No, that's impossible. I didn't agree to that. The nurse's eyes filled with pity, but she said nothing more. She just adjusted my blanket and slipped out, leaving me alone with a body that no longer felt like mine. I lay there for what felt like hours, tears sliding down into my hairline, a scream trapped in my chest. My husband, the man I trusted more than anyone, had signed away my choice, my future, without even telling me. And worse, the doctors had agreed, as if my consent was irrelevant, as if I were nothing more than a patient chart, with a signature from someone who claimed authority over me. When Thomas finally walked into the recovery room carrying a cup of coffee and a smile that looked rehearsed, I knew my life would never be the same. I stared at him, my voice raw and broken. "What did you do?" He blinked, feigning confusion. "What are you talking about?" "The surgery went well. They said you'll need a couple of weeks to recover." The rage surged through me, so hot it burned my throat. "You signed for them to take my uterus." His expression didn't even crack. That was the moment that chilled me to the bone. He didn't look shocked. He didn't even look guilty. He just sighed, as though I were being dramatic, unreasonable. "It was for the best," he said calmly. "The doctor said there were complications, and it was safer this way." I wanted to rip the IV out of my arm and scream until the hospital walls collapsed, but I couldn't move. I was still groggy, weak, trapped in a body that no longer belonged to me. My tears came fast and uncontrollable, soaking the pillow. Thomas reached for my hand, but I jerked it away, trembling. "You had no right," I whispered. His jaw tightened just slightly and then he leaned closer. His voice was low controlled. You'll understand later. You've always been too emotional about these things. I did what needed to be done. The words struck me harder than the surgery ever could. Too emotional, too fragile, too incapable of making decisions about my own body. That was how he saw me. That was why he hadn't asked, hadn't waited, hadn't given me the chance to fight for myself. I closed my eyes because I couldn't bear to look at him anymore. In that moment, something inside me fractured. My trust, my marriage, my identity. They all crumbled like sand slipping through my fingers. When the nurse returned to check my vitals, I didn't speak. I just stared at the ceiling, replaying the words over and over. Why would he approve that procedure? The nurse hadn't known she was detonating a bomb with her question, but she had. And the fallout was only beginning. As I lay there in that sterile room listening to Thomas hum quietly to himself, as if nothing had changed, I made a silent vow: this was not the end of my story. They had taken something from me without my consent, but I would not let them take my voice. My rage would become my weapon. My grief would become my fuel. And Thomas would learn, whether in a courtroom, a hospital board hearing, or under the crushing weight of truth, that I was not the weak, obedient wife he thought I was. Because sometimes the deepest betrayals don't just wound you, they awaken you. When I was finally discharged from the hospital 3 days later, I left with more than a box of painkillers and a folder of post-op instructions. I left with a hollow ache in my body and a storm brewing in my chest. Every step I took down that sterile hallway toward the exit felt heavier, as though the weight of betrayal clung to me like a lead cloak. Thomas carried my bag, walking a few paces ahead as if nothing had happened. He didn't notice or didn't care that I was limping from more than just surgical wounds. He kept making small talk about the traffic, the weather, even what we should eat when we got home, as though erasing the gravity of what he had done with mundane chatter could make it disappear. But nothing could erase it. The first night back in our house, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, my hand pressed flat against my abdomen. My body was still swollen and sore, but it was the emptiness beneath my palm that kept me from sleeping. The knowledge that something irreversible had been taken. The dreams I didn't even know I cherished until they were stolen quiet Sunday mornings, holding a baby, watching Thomas's features soften in the face of fatherhood, hearing a child call me mom. Those weren't fantasies anymore. They were corpses buried in my body. I rolled over and studied Thomas as he slept. His chest rose and fell steadily, his face peaceful, almost smug. The man I thought was my partner had become a stranger overnight. And yet, a chilling thought crept in. Maybe he had always been this man, and I had simply chosen not to see it. In the days that followed, I played the part of recovery. I shuffled between the couch and the bed, forced soup down my throat, and let Thomas help me with chores I no longer had the strength to do. Outwardly, I was weak, dependent, pliable. But inside, my anger sharpened into a blade. I needed answers. When Thomas left for work one morning, I called the hospital. My voice shook as I asked to speak with the surgeon. At first, they gave me the usual runaround privacy policies, medical jargon, evasive answers. But I pressed harder, reminding them I was the patient that it was, my body cut open on their table. Finally, I was connected to Dr. Whitmore. His tone was professional, almost rehearsed. Yes, Mrs. Callahan, during the appendectomy, we noticed extensive endometriosis and abnormal bleeding. It was deemed medically necessary to remove your uterus to prevent future complications. I clutched the phone tighter. Medically necessary. Then why wasn't I told? Why wasn't I given the choice? There was a pause. Your husband signed the consent form on your behalf. In emergent situations, that is legally permissible. Emergent. My voice cracked with disbelief. I went in for an appendix removal, not to be sterilized. I wasn't dying, was I? Another pause. A cough. It was precautionary. The word landed like acid in my stomach. Precautionary, not life-saving, not urgent, just convenient. I hung up the phone, my hands trembling so violently I almost dropped it. That was when I realized the truth. Thomas hadn't just signed paperwork in a panic. He had chosen this, and the doctors had gone along with it. My future, my autonomy had been erased because two men decided they knew better than I did. That night, I confronted Thomas. I waited until after dinner until he settled into the recliner with a beer in hand, the television flickering across his face. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears, but my voice was steady when I spoke. Why did you really do it? He glanced at me confused. Do what? I stepped closer, my fists clenched at my sides. Don't play dumb. Why did you sign for them to take my uterus? His jaw worked, his lips pressing into a thin line. For the first time, a flicker of irritation crossed his face. Because it needed to be done. You've always had issues with your cycles, the pain, the doctor said it was bad. This way, it's solved. You should be thanking me. Thanking you. My voice broke into a bitter laugh. You robbed me of a choice. You took something from me I can never get back. I trusted you, and you decided my life for me. He set the beer down harder than necessary, his expression hardening. You're being dramatic again. We weren't going to have kids anyway. You said it yourself 100 times you weren't sure. You don't even like children. Tears stung my eyes. Not sure isn't the same as never. And even if I had decided never, it was still my decision, not yours. Silence hung heavy between us. His eyes, once soft and familiar, now looked cold, calculating. I did what was best for both of us, he said finally, as if that closed the matter. But it didn't. It opened something much darker inside me. Over the next few weeks, I began to piece together fragments of truth. I requested my medical records, poring over every line of the surgical notes. I found the form with Thomas's signature granting permission for additional procedures as deemed necessary. I learned that the necessity had been exaggerated, that my condition could have been managed with less invasive treatments. But most damning of all, I discovered that Thomas had known about my endometriosis for months. He had gone to consultations behind my back discussing my options with doctors before I even felt the first stab of appendix pain. He had prepared for this, planned it. The realization nearly shattered me. My husband hadn't just betrayed me in a moment of crisis, he had orchestrated it. And yet I kept quiet, at least on the surface. I needed him to believe I was broken, too devastated to fight back. Because in that silence I began to build something stronger than grief. I began to build revenge. I started small. Grief is loud, but revenge requires silence. Each morning I pretended to move slower, weaker than I was. I let Thomas believe the surgery had drained me of fight of spirit. He would glance at me across the dinner table, smug in his confidence that I was diminished, pliable. But inside I was sharpening every ounce of pain into a weapon. The first step was information. I contacted a lawyer discreetly, a woman named Marissa, who came highly recommended by a friend from college. I sat across from her in a quiet office, clutching my medical records like a lifeline, my voice trembling as I explained everything. She listened intently, her brow furrowing deeper with every detail. This isn't just malpractice, she said finally, her tone grave. This is assault. They took away your ability to bear children without your consent. And if what you're saying about your husband's involvement is true, he could be held liable too. The word assault landed heavy in my chest, but also true. That was what it was. Not a medical decision, not a misunderstanding. An assault on my body, my autonomy, my life. Marissa warned me it would be ugly. Hospitals protect their own. Lawyers twist words, and men like Thomas rarely crumble easily. But when she asked if I was ready, I didn't hesitate. Yes, I whispered. I have nothing left to lose. The lawsuit began quietly, almost invisibly. Letters, depositions, a slow burn of paperwork. I didn't tell Thomas at first. I wanted to gather everything, record statements, proof of his complicity. When I finally served him the papers, it was at our kitchen table on a Tuesday night. I slid the envelope across to him, my hand steady for the first time in weeks. He ripped it open, scanning the contents, and his face went crimson. "You're suing me?" he hissed, slamming the papers down. "I'm suing everyone who took part in what happened to me," I said evenly. "That includes you." His laugh was sharp, bitter. "You think anyone's going to believe you? You're hysterical. You're unstable. God, you can't even handle your emotions half the time. They'll see that." I felt the old sting of his words, the way he'd always tried to belittle me as too emotional, too irrational. But this time, I didn't flinch. "They'll see the truth. I have the documents. I have the nurse's statement. And I'm not afraid of you anymore." His eyes narrowed. "You'll regret this." Maybe I would, but the deeper regret would have been silence. As the case unfolded, so did the secrets. Depositions revealed that Thomas had indeed been consulting with doctors months before my appendix even burst. He had framed it as concern for my chronic pain, painting himself as a caring husband, desperate to relieve me of suffering. In reality, he had been laying the groundwork to rid himself of the possibility of children he never wanted, though he had never told me that truth outright. But the most shocking revelation came not from him, but from my own family. I had always believed my parents adored Thomas. They praised his steady job, his charm, his reliability. But when news of the lawsuit reached them, my mother called me late one night, her voice shaking. "Anna," she whispered, "there's something you need to know." I braced myself, heart pounding. "Thomas. He came to us months ago. He said he was worried about you, about your health. He told us you might not survive pregnancy, that it could kill you. He asked us to support his decision if it came to it." I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. "And what did you say?" Silence. Then quietly, we told him we trusted his judgment. The betrayal cut deeper than the scalpel had. My own parents had sided with him, had given him silent permission to mutilate me without my knowledge. I wanted to scream, to curse them, to cut them from my life entirely. But instead, I hung up numb. It wasn't just Thomas anymore. The conspiracy of silence stretched further than I'd realized. The trial became a battlefield. The hospital's lawyers painted me as unstable, exaggerating, desperate for a payout. Thomas sat smugly beside them, shaking his head whenever my name was mentioned, playing the part of the reasonable husband who had only wanted to save his fragile wife. But then came the turning point. The nurse. The same young woman who had whispered to me in the recovery room, who had slipped truth into my ears when no one else dared. She took the stand, her hands trembling, her voice quiet but clear. I asked her if she knew about the second procedure she testified. She didn't. She was shocked, devastated. I remember thinking, why would he approve that procedure if she hadn't been told? Her words echoed through the courtroom like a bell tolling. I saw jurors shift uncomfortably in their seats. I saw the judge's expression tighten. And for the first time, I saw Thomas pale. It wasn't over, not yet. There would be more testimony, more character assassinations, more attempts to paint me as hysterical. But the crack had appeared. The facade of control Thomas had built was crumbling. At night, when I lay alone in my bed, the bed he no longer shared since I had forced him out, I would press my hand against my abdomen again. The wound was healing, but the scar was permanent. And yet, beneath the grief, something else had begun to grow. Strength. I had been stripped of choice, of trust, of illusions. But in their place, I was discovering a resilience I never knew I had. And though Thomas thought he had silenced me, he had in fact awakened a voice I could no longer hold back. The trial was still raging, the outcome uncertain. But one thing was clear: Thomas would never again mistake my silence for weakness. The weeks of trial stretched into months each day, peeling away another layer of the life I thought I knew. I had always imagined betrayal as something sharp and sudden, like a knife to the back. But what I came to understand was that betrayal could be slow, methodical, and deliberate, carried out by people who smiled at you across the dinner table and held your hand in public. The hospital's defense grew more vicious. They produced psychologists who had never met me but testified that my emotional instability made it reasonable for Thomas to act on my behalf. They cited journal articles about the risks of endometriosis and pregnancy complications, framing the hysterectomy as a life-saving measure. And each time Thomas sat there in his tailored suit, nodding solemnly, occasionally glancing toward the jury as though to say, "See, I was only protecting her." But then came my turn to speak. I stood in that courtroom, every eye fixed on me, my palms damp with sweat. My voice trembled at first, but as I spoke, the words gained strength. I told them what it felt like to wake up from surgery and realize a choice had been stolen. I described the dreams that would never come true, the children I'd never hold, the life paths that were closed without my consent. I recounted the nurse's words, the chill in my husband's eyes when I confronted him, the phone call with my mother that left me hollow. I didn't just give them facts, I gave them the raw truth of my grief. At one point, my voice broke and I pressed my hand to my stomach, tears sliding down my cheeks. "They didn't just take my uterus," I whispered. "They took my trust. They took the right to decide who I was and who I could be. And the person who should have protected me, the man I loved, was the one who signed it all away." The courtroom was silent. Even the judge looked shaken. And then Thomas stood to testify. He was confident, smooth, almost rehearsed. He painted a picture of a husband forced into an impossible situation, guided only by love and fear for his wife's safety. "She was always hesitant about motherhood," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was saving her." But cross-examination stripped him bare. Marissa pressed him on the consultations he'd attended without me, on the inconsistencies in his timeline, on the fact that the hysterectomy had been labeled precautionary, not emergent. Slowly, piece by piece, the facade cracked. The final blow came when Marissa presented emails, ones I hadn't known about until discovery. Emails between Thomas and Dr. Whitmore dated weeks before my appendix ruptured. In them, Thomas wrote, "Anna has been waffling about children for years. I don't want to risk it anymore. If there's an opportunity during surgery, we should go ahead with the hysterectomy. I'll handle the paperwork." The courtroom gasped. Thomas stammered, tried to backtrack, but the damage was done. His careful image of the loving husband collapsed in an instant, revealing the truth. He hadn't acted out of fear or compassion. He had acted out of convenience, selfishness, and control. When the verdict finally came, I sat trembling in my seat. The jury found in my favor. The hospital was ordered to pay damages, Dr. Whitmore faced disciplinary action, and Thomas was held liable for his role in the deception. It should have felt like victory. And in some ways it did. Justice had been served, at least on paper. The world now knew the truth, and Thomas could no longer hide behind lies. But as I walked out of that courthouse, the sun blinding after months of sterile fluorescent lights, I felt something else. Not triumph, not relief, just emptiness, because no verdict could give me back what I had lost. No amount of money could restore the part of me that had been taken while I slept. No punishment for Thomas could erase the betrayal of my parents, who had chosen his voice over mine. I stood on the courthouse steps, the crowd dispersing around me, and for the first time in months I breathed deeply. The scar on my abdomen still ached, but beneath it something new was growing. Not hope, not yet, but strength. I had survived what should have broken me. I had spoken when they tried to silence me. I had fought back when they thought I would fold. That night, alone in my apartment, I had long since left the house Thomas and I once shared. I poured myself a glass of wine and stared at my reflection in the window. My face looked older, harder, but my eyes were alive in a way they hadn't been in years. I whispered to my reflection as if to seal it into truth. "They took one part of me, but they didn't take all of me. And I will never let anyone make decisions for me again." And though the wound of betrayal would never fully heal, I knew this. The fire it left in me would keep me warm for the rest of my life. In the months after the verdict, my life became both quieter and louder at the same time. Quieter because the daily battles were over. No more depositions, no more sterile courtrooms, no more nights rehearsing testimony in my head. But louder too, because the silence left space for everything I had been pushing down. Grief, rage, betrayal, loneliness. They rose to the surface like smoke curling from a fire that refused to die out. I'd wake in the middle of the night, hand pressed against my stomach, as if my body itself were trying to remind me of what had been taken. Sometimes I'd cry until dawn, mourning the children I'd never meet, the moments I'd never have. Other times I would just sit in the darkness, numb, staring at nothing, letting the hollow ache spread through me like frost. And yet, alongside the grief, there was something else growing: resilience. Every morning, I got up even when I didn't want to. I cooked meals for myself, paid my bills, cleaned my small apartment. Simple things, but they reminded me I was still here, still capable. And every time I did, I felt a little stronger. What hurt most wasn't Thomas, it was my parents. They didn't call after the verdict. Not to apologize, not even to argue. Just silence. At first, I thought I'd feel relieved that cutting them out would be clean surgical final, but the truth was messier. I missed them. I missed my mother's voice, my father's steady presence, the comfort of knowing I belonged to a family. Now when I thought of them all, I felt was a cold distance, as if they had chosen him over me, long before the trial ever began. One afternoon, months later, I received a letter in the mail. It was from my mother. Her handwriting was shaky, her words uneven. Anna, I don't expect you to forgive us. What we did was wrong. We thought we were helping, but the truth is, we didn't want to believe you were capable of deciding for yourself. We let Thomas convince us that he knew best. I see now how badly we failed you. I'm sorry more than words can say. Please, if you can find it in your heart, I'd like to see you again. I sat with that letter for days. At first, I wanted to burn it, to let the flames consume her apology the way their betrayal had consumed me. But eventually, I tucked it into a drawer. Forgiveness wasn't a gift I was ready to give. Maybe someday, maybe never. But I wasn't going to let their choices define me any longer. As for Thomas, I never saw him again. He tried at first. He left messages on my phone, some angry, some pleading, some dripping with the same condescension he had always wielded. "You ruined my life," Anna, one of them said. "I was just trying to protect us. You'll regret this." But with each message, his voice sounded smaller, less powerful. Eventually, the calls stopped. He became a ghost, a chapter I refused to reopen. And yet his shadow lingered. In every man I met afterward, I searched for signs of him: the control, the manipulation, the quiet way he had convinced me I was fragile. It took time and therapy and countless nights of reflection, but slowly I began to untangle myself from his grip. I started writing. At first it was just in journals, pages filled with anger, sorrow, confusion. But soon it grew into something more. I began sharing pieces of my story online anonymously at first. To my surprise, women responded. Women who had been silenced, who had been betrayed, who had woken up from surgeries to find their bodies altered without their consent. Some stories were different, but the thread was the same. They too had been robbed of choice. It was then I realized something powerful. My story wasn't just mine, it was ours. And in speaking it, I wasn't just reclaiming my voice, I was handing a torch to others who thought they had to suffer in the dark. The first time I stood in front of a small women's support group, my hand shook so badly I thought I'd drop my notes. But when I looked into their faces, eyes brimming with recognition, with unspoken pain, I felt the words rise up from somewhere deeper than fear. I told them everything: the hospital, the betrayal, the trial, the aftermath. I told them that healing wasn't linear, that some days I still woke up aching, that forgiveness wasn't always possible. But I also told them this. They tried to silence me, and maybe they succeeded for a while. But I found my voice again, and so will you. Afterward, women hugged me, some with tears in their eyes, some with trembling smiles. And in their embrace, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: purpose. The scar on my abdomen will never fade completely. Neither will the memory of that nurse's whispered words. Why would he approve that procedure? Or the sound of Thomas's calm, calculated lies? But I've learned something through it all. Betrayal cuts deep, but it also clears space. Space to rebuild, to redefine, to reclaim. I may never have children. I may never forgive Thomas or my parents. But I will never again hand over my voice, my choice, my body to someone who thinks they know me better than I know myself. If you've listened this far, I want you to hear me clearly. No matter how deep the wound, no matter how heavy the betrayal, you are not powerless. Your voice matters. Your choices matter. And you are stronger than the ones who tried to break you. If my story touched you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe so we can keep building this community of voices together. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me your story, or simply let me know I'm not alone.